In this lecture, we'll talk about form validation in HTML5. The form validation in HTML5 is done via two attributes. First one is the required attribute and the other one is the pattern attribute. And we'll also see how we can validate different input types like checkboxes, radio buttons and text area in HTML5 using the required and pattern attribute. So here I've created a sample form with first name, email, telephone and URL, address, then some radio button and checkbox. So basically you can see that with the first name input type I have used the attribute required. Now the required attribute specifies that an input field must be filled out before submitting the form. So if you're using the required attribute, you make sure that you are submitting the form using the input type submit. If you are doing it with some other buttons, like a simple general button type button, then this form validation will not kick in. Also, if you will have no validate specified in your form, so if you do this, no validate, then also the form validation will not take place. Now the required attribute works with text, search, URL, telephone, email, password, date pickers, number, checkbox, radio and file. One thing to note over here is that if you have a group of checkboxes, then the required attribute will not work on it. Similarly, we have another attribute called pattern. So let's say I want the user to enter the first name, but also I have to ensure that the user do not enter empty spaces. So to prevent the user from entering empty spaces, I can make use of a pattern attribute, and this pattern attribute can have a regex, that is a regular expression. So for instance, if I want the user to enter anything but not just empty spaces, then I'll be having this pattern. So this allows the user to enter any character but not spaces. If you are only entering spaces, then this will invalidate the input. So using the pattern, I'll be able to ensure that user has entered something in the first name. So we have seen that the pattern attribute specifies a regular expression that the input element's value is checked against. The pattern attribute works with text, search, URL, telephone, email and password input types, but it will not work with the text area. So here you can see that we have other types specified as well in the form like email, telephone and URL. Now the email itself takes care that the user must enter an email ID, but if you're not entering it at all, then this is not going to prompt you. So in order to ensure that you want it to make mandatory, you just make use of the required keyword. Similarly, you can do that with telephone and URL as well. Now with address, you can see that I've made use of the required attribute, but the pattern attribute will not work over here. So in order to ensure that the text area is not having just empty spaces in it, like pressing spacebar multiple times in the text area will validate this. So you'll have a set of empty spaces as input. But if you have to ensure that user has entered some information, we'll have to take help of JavaScript or jQuery to do further validation on text areas. Next we have radio buttons. So if you are having a set of radio buttons, you can just specify the required attribute with any one of them and the validation will kick in automatically. Similarly, if you are just having a single checkbox, like over here, where you have to accept terms and conditions, you can do that with the required attribute. So on single checkbox, this required attribute is going to work. Now let's see it in action by saving this and executing it in the browser. So here we have our form now. You can see that if I click on submit, it will first prompt me to fill out this first name. So let's say I've just entered spaces over here, and here you can see that the title is coming up, please match the requested format. Now if I click on submit again, you'll see that same message appearing because the pattern is not validated. So here I have to enter something, not just spaces, like this one is a valid entry. Now again I'm asked to fill out email because I made that mandatory as well using the required attribute. So here also you will have to provide a valid email ID. If you're not doing that, like this, you can see that it's saying that the format is not correct. Now if I click on submit, this is going to ask you to input something in the text area. Here also enter a set of spaces and click on submit. It validates that because the pattern attribute is not going to work on the text area. So here we'll have to take help of JavaScript or jQuery to further validate the text area so that no one just enters empty spaces and submits the data. Now with the radio button, if I click on submit, you can see that it says please select one of these options, and if I select one, it's validated. Similarly here, if there's a single checkbox, I can make use of that required attribute, and whenever I'll try to submit it, it will ensure that this checkbox is checked. So now that we have filled our form nice and proper, we can submit it now. So this is how we do HTML5 validation using just HTML5 attributes, required and pattern.